Okay, so good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to the session on raw materials and how Canada is part of the solution for Europe. On this panel, we've got David Anderson, Managing Director of Saskatchewan Trade and Invest. David's in the middle. Jan Mitchell, he's a partner at Gowling WGL. He's on my left-hand side. And at the end of the panel, we got Sujith Kollamthodi, Director of Policy, and he's part of the Strategy Department at Ricardo, right? So welcome to all of you to this very interesting session. When it comes to raw materials, we need to look a bit into what has happened in the past years. We should start at the beginning of COVID. I think that when it comes to COVID, there was a very strong impact on apparently there was a very strong impact on the distribution of raw materials across the world. But if you think about it and the impact of it, we went through the whole pandemic maintaining business continuity when it came to distribution of raw materials. But for some reason, from COVID, from that period, we seem to be entering a new world order. Where we have got an uprise of the right-wing protectionism, emerging wars, a sort of deglobalization, and more of an inward-looking economy. And obviously that comes in the equation of the raw materials availability globally, as we all know. We also have regulation, and this is the area of expertise I come from. The Green Deal imposes more and more reporting, sustainability reporting on enterprises, and a lot of due diligence. All enterprises now will be impacted by a corporate due diligence regulation that looks into human rights and environmental performance of enterprises, and that will also change the dynamics between suppliers of raw materials and businesses in Europe. So that also needs to take into account. And it's not only about reporting, there's also due diligence in digital product passports, as some of you may know, and all of this will come into play. So the discussion between Canada and Europe on raw materials becomes a very interesting discussion because, you know, if you think about it, if you look at human rights, if you look into environmental performance, and you look at the expectations of Europe, there's a very good alignment. So my first question is for all of the panelists, and it revolves around this same topic. So when it comes to financial, environmental, and social sustainability, why are Canada and the EU natural partners? So I don't know who wants to start answering this question, but
I can start. Thanks very much for the question, and thanks to Sam and all the organizers for the invite here today. So in terms of raw materials, why are EU and Canada natural partners? I think I could sum it up with three words: complementarity, geopolitics, and proximity. On the complementarity side of things, basically Canada has what the EU needs and vice versa. We have the resources, we have the technology, we have the social license. In Europe, they have the markets and they have the industry to produce. Even though that Europe is trying to increase domestic supply of raw materials, I think the mining industry in Europe is recognizing that it's difficult to build new mines in Europe. In Canada and in Saskatchewan, moreover, it's very much part of our culture. We do have this social license in Saskatchewan on its own. We have 25 active mines in the province with another 65 that are currently undergoing exploration or development. Secondly, on the geopolitics side of things, I think that we're in for a little bit of a bumpy ride over the next couple of years. And I think at uncertain times like these, it's an opportunity for like-minded, trusted, long-term partners such as Canada and the EU to strengthen that relationship. And then finally, on the proximity side of things, we're just across the Atlantic. It might seem like a far way away, but compared to other supply sources, and I won't name any names, but Australia is very far away. I'll leave it there.
Jan?
Well, I think David summarized it very well. I think coming from a mining background, one of the things you hear all the time is you don't get to pick where your deposits are. So it happens that Canada, as David mentioned, is blessed with a whole host of resources. So with nothing else, that's a good starting point. I think then you have a very developed economy very common backgrounds. I think earlier today, in one of the panels, we were called the most European of the non-European countries, was sort of the term that was used. We have common history, common understanding. You add to the fact that Canada has what I call a competitive advantage in mining, probably only second or equivalent to Australia, not second, but it's only really Australia and Canada that sort of the developed nations have had such a large focus on mining. You take a look at the US, anywhere in the EU, no one that experience doesn't exist by and large, or it exists in a very small quantity. So we have the resources, we have the experience, and we also have governments at both the provincial and federal levels that are committed to the energy transition and to creating a new ecosystem in which the new technologies and the low carbon future can thrive. So I think when you add those all together, it's a great combination.
Maybe just to add to that, I think David and Ian have covered it really well. Maybe the final point I'd like to add is really both EU and Canada have a commitment to high levels of sustainability, and that's going to be increasingly important for all of the products that use critical raw materials. That we see that from the EU side. We also see a lot of action starting to take place in Canada, particularly around the extractive industry. So again, I think this is another angle that the partnership can focus on.
Thank you so much for very good answers. So we're more or less all convinced that we're not going back to the pre-COVID era of limitless globalization. So Canada and Europe need to adapt and address many challenges like many of the world's economies. Strategic partnerships are key to navigate a more tumultuous business environment to ensure business continuity and sustainability. Why is Canada not given more prominence in Europe given these circumstances?
Well, I'll start. So I've been in mining for 20 years, and in my view, the reason there isn't more focus is because Europe has not had to deal with mining. Europe has been a manufacturing economy, a very advanced sort of processes sort of down the food chain, and has never had to focus on where the raw materials came from. The raw materials were there when you needed them. There were traders, Trafigura, Glencore. There were markets. Everyone could buy whatever they needed whenever they needed it, and the sort of just-in-time system worked. I think with the supply chain shocks, the lithium price shocks, with happened a couple of years ago, with the focus on ESG, I think it's probably the first time in a long time that a lot of companies in Europe are now having to look down the food chain and say, hey, where's this coming from? Am I going to have a supply? What's happening here? So it doesn't surprise me. European investors haven't even been that prominent in the mining space historically. There have been some, but it's been more sort of US, Canadian, Australian, UK. There haven't been a ton of sort of funds in Germany, for example, investing in building mines over the last 20 years. And so I think it's really sort of that change, that sort of sea change in how we look at the world and how people are looking at sort of the life cycle of products that we haven't been as present because we were sort of further down the food chain. And I think now European companies are having to look further down the food chain. The other reality is I think Canada's moving up too, because of our clean grid, et cetera. We're hosting gigafactories, refining lithium, sort of all those other things. So we're also moving up the food chain in terms of what we're producing. But it's my thoughts.
Maybe just to add to that, I think another angle. You could look at it as an opportunity or a potential threat, and that you've got the Critical Raw Materials Act in the EU. That puts a big focus on diversification of supply chains. Actually, that offers a huge opportunity for Canada actually to take a more prominent position. Of course, others will look at that too. So again, there will be some competition around that, but I think it's a huge opportunity, really.
I don't have a 20-year history in mining, so I'm actually new to Europe as well. Saskatchewan just opened up the Germany office based in Berlin last year. My previous 12 years were spent in Tokyo, but my impression so far is that the EU does look at Canada as a trusted and reliable partner. However, what Ian has said is we need to be a little bit more present, and I think that something that's missing is some major projects connecting the EU and Canada. A little bit of a side story, I was posted to Tokyo, and my family and I moved there 2 weeks after the big earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster in 2011. Not a good time to move to the country. But at that time, 30% of the electricity supply in Japan immediately went off the grid as they shut off all the nuclear. And the Japanese were looking everywhere around the world for a stable, secure supplier of LNG to fill that gap. Canada looked like the natural partner. I think that there was somewhere around 18 different projects, LNG proposed projects that sprung up in BC. There was a lot of hope. We didn't get it done in a timely manner. We didn't get it done, and that hurt Canada's reputation for a few years. However, on the bright side of things, with persistence, with collaboration between governments, countries, industry, we now have LNG Canada coming online, as well as a number of LNG projects. So Canada is regaining that strong reputation as a stable, secure supplier of resources, and I am optimistic that it won't take as long for Canada and the EU.
Let me just clarify quickly. My comments were very specific to mining. I think, as Minister Ng pointed out earlier, we have a great relationship with Europe on major areas. I just think it was the difference in the economy in that specific space.
Okay, so the next question is more for David. And so Canada is the second largest country after Russia. Most of us know that. Access to raw material is seen as a big opportunity, but comes with challenges, right? And from a financial competitive supply chain infrastructures perspective, what are the opportunities, but most importantly, what are the challenges? Because I think that will unlock the situation we're in right now, where we can collaborate more, right?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm an optimist, so I'll focus more on the opportunities. And as it is a question focused more on Canada, EU, but with my title being the Saskatchewan representative, I'll stick to the province and let my colleagues comment on broader Canada opportunities. For those in the audience not familiar with Saskatchewan, we are a Western Canadian province in the heart of the Canadian prairies. The province is roughly twice the size of the country of Germany. However, the population is similar to that of Munich's. So we've got a lot of space for mining activities. As I mentioned before, we have 25 active projects and 65 undergoing different stages of exploration and development. Again, this year, Saskatchewan was ranked as the third best destination for investment in mining and the top in Canada. We are the largest producer of potash globally. We produce roughly 40% global share of potash in the province, of which we have major investments from European partners. A German company called K+S has already invested $4 billion in their potash production, and they're expanding further. Second largest producer globally in uranium, which is expected to be, we were expected to take the top stop in the next 5 to 10 years as new projects come online. Now, I do recognize that both potash and uranium are not on the EU critical minerals list. However, they are very important to Saskatchewan, Canada, and our European partners, and we do continue to receive new inquiries for investment and offtake in these two resources. Specifically on the EU critical mineral list, Saskatchewan has occurrences of 21 of the 34, including 11 on the critical list. And just to name a few, the province has quite a bit of activity going on in helium, lithium, copper, and rare earth elements. So helium in the province of Saskatchewan, we are the largest producer of helium in Canada, with plans to take up 10% of global share by 2030. So lots going on in that space. On the lithium side of things, lithium in the province of Saskatchewan is found in brine in existing wells. We have several projects that are coming onto commercial stage, and it being in brine rather than in hard rock is quite a bit more sustainable when producing. One of the companies on lithium is actually, Caroline was mentioning the Raw Materials Week that's happening in Brussels. We'll have that company coming over pitching to European investors. On the copper side of things, in 2026, Foran Mining, McIlvenny Bay project, will become the world's first net zero copper mine, and it's coming online in 2026, so we're very excited about that. And then finally, rare earth elements. What's happening in the province, thanks to the Saskatchewan Research Council, we're building the whole value chain from ores down to metals now, with the next step being magnets. So what the Saskatchewan Research Council is doing is taking ores and then processing all the way down to rare earth metals. with the next stage of investment that we're looking for is permanent magnet manufacturing. The operations are already commercially available to produce 10 tons per month, moving up to 400 tons per year. And the end product, the permanent magnets, it's not used in the battery of electric vehicles, but this is more on the motor side of things. So we're getting quite a bit of engagement from European OEMs on that project. Challenge aside, I mean, uncertain and volatile markets create uncertain investment environments. And how do we overcome that? I think more investment needs to be done on both sides by Canadian, provincial, and European governments.
But isn't Canada more of a guarantee, more certainty? Considering the evolution of geopolitics, wouldn't Canada represent more stability? And
well, I think it does, but I just came from a mining conference in London, so we talked a lot about this. The stability is one thing. I think the larger issue that sort of we in the West need to overcome is what we were calling short-termism. It's trying to measure projects and returns in short time frames. It just doesn't work in mining, right? And so mining projects can take 10 years to come online. You may need to build infrastructure to get to the resource. And so it's less the political stability, it's more the will of governments and investors to put capital in today when that return may not come out for 10, 15, 20 years. And that's really where, at least I see, the market has disappeared, right? For a project that's close to permitting, that's very advanced, you can find any number of people to bank that project, right? From an equity side, from a bank side, from an offtake side. But for the next projects, the ones that we're looking to sort of continue this down the road, those ones aren't getting the risk capital anymore. That capital has left. People would prefer to invest in an EFT that tracks a commodity rather than investing in the company that's going to mine the commodity. But that doesn't move us closer to having more of that commodity, right? And so we live now in a world that's so short-term focused that it's hard to get that long-term patient capital that's going to invest in those projects. And so Canada has the stability. It sort of checks the boxes on clean grid, on a whole lot of other things that people are looking for, but we're still not seeing that money coming in to bring that next stage of project online.
so it's fundamentally a sustainable finance problem, right? That is too short.
Yeah,
sighted.
it's a disconnect between the mindset.
You buy raw materials, so you probably see it from.
Well, I'd just like to add to what Ian's saying. I mean, I totally agree with what he's saying. I think it's also a competitiveness issue for the EU, well, just globally as well. You know, how are we going to remain competitive with China, for example, unless we actually take a longer term view? And this is something, and it's not just in this sector. I mean, we see it in multiple sectors, actually, the same as part of the green transition. So it's probably something that needs to be addressed more systemically, I think. This short-termism is a major issue, I think, and it's one of those challenges that you highlighted in the question, really.
If I can just sum it up in a quick anecdote. I was talking to one of my German partners not that long ago, and he'd been talking to an OEM, and they were looking at the price of lithium and said, oh, the price of lithium has come down. We don't need to worry about it anymore. And then I get a call from a client from China who said the price of lithium is down. It's a great buying opportunity. And so I think that sort of summarized in my head the entire disconnect that we have between what I will call the Western world and why China has these commodities today, because they look at today as a buying opportunity. When there's a blip in the market, they're confident this technology is going to continue, right? EVs are going to continue to go. They're going to continue to build batteries. They view it as a buying opportunity. And we, like, it's not just Europe, the United States, Canada, we're like, oh, the price is down. We'll just go back to the way we were doing it before. It's not a problem. Things are okay now. And I think that's sort of an easy way to think about it.
Long-term thinking. Huh? Yeah, good. If we think about it, the raw material access, sourcing, and distribution are key to the transition. Huh? Where if we want to move out of fossil fuel producing energy, you're going to have to go more into raw materials. And this transition goes to electrification, and electrification of mobility, heating, energy distribution, and even the production of energy itself through renewables and perhaps nuclear energy. But these transitions are never smooth, right? You cannot actually write on a piece of paper and plan it like you would do a normal business plan and expect it to roll out smoothly. And actually, we're seeing the signs of it, especially in electrical mobility or electrical vehicles, where we see a slowdown in financial difficulties, especially in the battery sector, new tariffs, resistance also of the automotive industry. We see a lot of that in Europe, in Italy, and Germany, of going to electrification of mobility because of the legacy that comes with the combustion engine. So how are these challenges affecting the raw material sector in Canada and perhaps even the EU? And how do we overcome these issues? How do we create a stability in this transition in such a way that the transition occurs, we reduce our emissions, and we have a transition from oil as a raw material to more minerals that are needed to build the batteries, to build the cables, the network?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, because I think if we look, and you touched on electric vehicle demand, so there's a lot of media talk about a slowdown or sales going down. Actually, when you look globally, sales are up 25% this year. Now, that is not equally distributed across the world, and certainly in certain regions, the take-up is slower, but it's still growing. That does cause some challenges really around the supply, and Ian's touched on it, the price of lithium dropping recently, that's linked. But I'll just highlight, in China, 1 in every 2 cars sold this year has got a plug on it, and that is only going to continue to grow. So we can see the long-term direction of travel, right? That is what's going to happen, and it's how do we stay the course? That's really what it comes down to, from my perspective, anyway.
Ian, do you have for?
It's sort of a subset of, I think, my prior question, or my prior response. Like there's a lot of opportunity, right? To Sujith's point, like this is going to continue, right? And I think it requires the vision on the part of government and corporation to realize that that's going to happen and to plan today for it. If people were planning today for what they needed, they would look at today as a buying opportunity. People would acquire lithium, copper, whatever it was. They would make the investment. The price would come back up. And then that would sort of justify it, right? But we sort of sit there and we look at things in terms of a commodity cycle. The price is down today, that's bad, right? So let's avoid investing in copper, right? And it just sort of, it continues that cycle on the Western side. For me, it's just, looking further down the road, planning out where you think you're going to be, and then making reasonable bets. And government shouldn't get in trouble for that. Corporations shouldn't get in trouble for that. But we live in a world where everyone watches their stocks on a daily basis from their phone. So it's a challenge.
I would echo Ian's long-term thinking statement. So political uncertainty, commodity volatility is challenging, especially for a province like Saskatchewan, which very much depends on commodity exports. That being said, we are seeing, to Sujith's point, there is a continuing growing demand. It's just not going as fast as possible. So I think long-term thinking, long-term investing, long-term planning is very important. And with the potential of a U.S.-China trade war coming into place, again, this is an opportunity for Canada and EU to step up and strengthen that relationship overall.
So there is a sort of alignment between sourcing strategy, business strategy. If we look at it long term, short term, it might look like there's no alignment, but longer term, there is. Now, we're always convinced that everything that's new, like electrical cars or electrical vehicles or energy storage or electricity in itself, is cleaner than oil. But honestly, if you do then the life cycle assessments, things might look a bit different. And Sujith, you kind of, in our discussions before the panel, you kind of suggested that this needs to be considered. The transition is beneficial, but we need to be very careful about the true benefits and perhaps the boundary conditions in which we're going to be working with these new technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if we look at, and just let's take the vehicle sector again as an example, we're moving from a world that was relatively simple in the internal combustion engine era, when we were trying to look at the sustainability performance of a vehicle. We focused on the vehicle tailpipe emissions. They accounted for around 85% of the greenhouse gas impacts of a vehicle. And now we're moving to a world where actually those environmental impacts are more distributed around not just the greenhouse gas emissions, but the different materials that we're using. We're changing where the balance of greenhouse gas emissions might occur in the life cycle of the vehicle. We need to take into account not just the greenhouse gas emissions, but the mineral and metal resource uses, water resource consumption, impacts on air pollution, impacts on biodiversity. This is all quite complicated. Now, we have done a major study for the European Commission. This is 4 years ago, it was published, which looked at all the different types of vehicles. So passenger cars, vans, trucks, buses, every type of powertrain you can think of. So all the different types of internal combustion engine, all the different types of biofuels, electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cell technologies, and 14 different environmental impact categories. And we didn't just look at now, i.e. 2020 as was at the time, but also projected out to 2050. What we see is that that picture becomes more complex for sure, yeah? And so you will see if you're looking at mineral consumption, of course, actually the electric vehicles, you've got a higher incidence of consumption compared to traditional internal combustion engines. But the balance across all the different environmental impact categories, EVs are still better, right? But you have to then weigh up these different environmental impact categories. And that's just going to become more complicated over time.
No, I've just had a plug for Canada here too. Because I think it's another area for cooperation, because Canada has a relatively clean grid compared to a number of other countries. We have a large quantity of hydro, we have nuclear, which is at least low carbon. I know there are differing views on that. And so to the extent that we can get grid access and better infrastructure to the mining projects themselves, we could have a much cleaner product from sort of mine all the way down to production. And then we obviously have the trade agreements with Europe and the US, which makes it sort of easy access to two of the largest markets. So there's a real opportunity with cooperation to decrease the overall life cycle, the overall carbon emissions in that life cycle.
Maybe just to add to that, I mean, this is next door to David in Manitoba province. There is, a first all-electric mine for lithium. And again, you can kind of see this is, that commitment to high sustainability standards, actually providing those sorts of products into the EU market, where we're seeing this sort of focus on sustainable, sustainability reporting. Whether it be from a regulatory perspective, where the EU is looking at product environmental footprint regulation, or indeed some of the vehicle manufacturers that I've been working with want to actually take a leadership position themselves and actually start disclosing the sustainability performance of their vehicles, not just from the environmental perspective, but also looking at things like human rights as well. So it's becoming increasingly important.
Thank you so much for the comprehensive answers. Does the location make a difference? Like, well, what are the key parameters in fully exploiting the benefits of this transition? What should people take into account? What society should be taking into account, or companies should be taking into account?
I mean, I'll say one of the obvious ones. Location does make a difference when you're trying to look at the full life cycle emissions. So the further you're transporting something, so just going back to the point about Australia, Australia transporting to Europe versus Canada, well, actually...
Yeah, but what about working conditions, or, because some parameters like ecotoxicity?
All these things count as well. So I think, location does make a difference.
Mm-hmm. And is Canada better positioned with respect to the products that you're doing for the European market, or there's no...
No, I think there are some benefits. I mean, it links to some of the things I've touched on, that investment in... clean technologies for mining. Actually, again, that's how you start reducing that footprint. But yeah, David, Ian, you may have other thoughts on this.
I was just gonna say, I think it's one of the opportunities, right? I think we have the key ingredients in Canada to sort of build that low carbon infrastructure and life cycle. And I think it's working with our partners and building sort of, again, that sort of long-term ecosystem and infrastructure, with the right investment. I think it could make a huge difference in terms of both transportation distances, electrification, technology, access to the minerals, hydro, nuclear, sort of to power a lot of the refining and the mining projects. Personally, I think it can make a big difference. And I think that's one of the opportunities for participation with the EU and others to build that all out.
Maybe just to add to that as well, I guess in Canada, if we think about the different raw materials, so Obviously, there's a lot of exploration and extraction on nickel and copper. Historically, that those have been key materials, and that's still going to be needed. But we need more cobalt. We need more rare earth elements. We need more lithium. We need more graphite. So again, there's an opportunity there. How do we go into those materials and taking into account sustainable mining, sustainable processing, and transportation? All of those are huge opportunities, I think, for Canada.
Thank you so much. Producing is one thing, but producing sustainably is another one. So why is sustainable raw material sector is critical for many innovations that will lead to the new ways of producing energy in the future? So this is perhaps a question for Sujith and Nian, but David, if you have any comments, they would be appreciated. So why is it important? I come from the oil industry, and one thing that I always felt is that the oil industry was sustainable for innovation because it was always there. It backed all of its assets. It loaded its operations with very talented research and innovation people, and you could develop any product. You always knew that Exxon, Dow, or BSF would knock on your door to help you develop your products. Is that also needed for raw materials that are going to be used for the future energy grid or energy storage or batteries? Or
yeah, I mean the demand for these materials is only going to go up, right? So actually partnering between companies to help achieve that is going to be really important. Almost every green transition technology we can think of requires these materials. So and again, it comes back to that point from earlier around long-term thinking, sustained thinking, and using that to build the business case. Ian.
I was just going to say, I read a stat recently that in 2017, we pulled more out of the earth than we had in all of our history prior to 1950. And so to me, it's not just critical, it's absolutely necessary, because we can't sort of continue at that pace. If you kept ramping up at that level, you're just not going to find economic deposits any longer. So I think, sustainability is key, and I think technology has to play a large part of that, especially on the recycling side, right? I think at the same time as we're trying to figure out economic ways and sustainable ways of pulling these materials out of the earth, we need to be looking equally hard at how we can be recycling them and reusing them, because there's going to come a point at which the former is just not tenable in order to supply the demand we have. And so I think, I don't know how we do it without sort of looking at sort of that circular economy and that whole life cycle, because it's not sustainable in the same growth as we've seen in the last little while.
If I could speak specific on Saskatchewan, it's in our branding. It's the way that we brand ourselves internationally is strong, sustainable Saskatchewan. And me being a little bit of a newbie to Europe, when speaking to European prospective investors on the mining or agriculture side of things, any project that they're getting involved with needs to match the ESG standards that are being set in place. So in the province, we know that if we are going to be building these projects, they need to fully be sustainable. Speaking back to the potash production, so Saskatchewan's number 1, number 2, and number 3 are Russia and Belarus. Potash production in the province of Saskatchewan is 50% more efficient than in these competing regions. I mentioned the net zero copper mine that's coming online in 2026. Saskatchewan also has a AAA credit rating for sustainable and ethical mining. So sustainable is definitely synonymous with Saskatchewan.
I take an opportunity to ask a question that wasn't planned to David. Does the federal government play an important role? Because I recall from when I studied in Canada and even worked in Canada, there was, the federal government, when it came especially to R&D and development and innovation, there was very strong backing. Is that still there for the raw materials of the future?
Looking into the audience and seeing some of my federal colleagues, I'm going to say yes, 100%.
Okay. I didn't know.
Yeah. No, my office is based in Berlin. We're inside the Embassy of Canada. No matter what's happening back in Canada, when we work overseas, we're all flying the Canadian flag. And what I always tell companies that we're doing business with, whether they're looking at offtake or investment with projects in the province, is collaboration with the federal government is extremely important. Because of the structure in Canada, collaboration with provincial governments and municipalities as well is also equally important. So, yes, is the answer to your question.
I would just throw into the top that I think, again, in my career, I think this is probably the time when I like to say I've seen the most governments across the spectrum rowing in the same direction. We'll see how far we get, but the feds, the provinces, municipalities, the city of Sudbury, the mayor is out, trying to promote mining. So I think everyone sees this as, a key to sort of solving the transition. And so I think there's, it's not that there aren't hurdles, but the political will is there to help make it happen right now.
Sujith?
Nothing to add, no.
Great. So I think that this discussion gave us a pretty good idea of what are the challenges and the opportunities. But we need to plan for further collaboration. So what would you suggest in terms of planning between Canada and the EU for the years to come? Since we're talking about long-term planning and long-term collaboration, what needs to be put into this plan? What already exists and what needs to be added?
I would say the million, but it's probably the billion-dollar question. I think governments are thinking about it now. I think that's sort of the stage we're at. I know Germany's created a critical mineral fund. I know the EU's looking at it. Again, I work in projects that take decades. So to me, every year we delay actually putting money into the ground moves everything back. So I think for me, it's getting governments and corporations to realize that you can't just invest sort of at the shovel-ready project if we're also not willing to invest earlier sort of in critical minerals companies that are at an earlier stage of development. We're just delaying the problem again, right? So I think it's really working on that mindset, educating governments, educating corporations, again, who have never had to look at this before. I don't blame them. This isn't something they had to solve for. Even in Canada, the government never solved for mining. This was dealt with largely by the capital markets. That sort of over COVID with the global uncertainty has fallen apart, right? You're not seeing the same levels of investment at the junior level. And so if governments and corporations aren't willing to take a longer term view and step in, then we're not really going to solve that problem, at least in the short term, in my view. So I think it's really about educating, talking to people, forcing people to sort of plan long term, and then try and find ways to implement that. I think there's also a lot on the technology side, right? There's, the recycling, the clean tech, green tech, like water treatment. There's a lot of opportunities to work sort of across the system here and building this ecosystem. And so, don't want to sound negative. I think there's a lot of possibility, and I think we have a ton of resources. The graphites, the rare earths, like all the things Sujith named are there. And I think so. I think with cooperation, we can find ways to deal with that economically and sort of make sure that we plan for where we want our world to be in the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Maybe just to add to that as well, I mean, I totally agree with what Ian's saying, and it is this long-term picture that we need to be thinking about. Just to maybe put some of that into context around why this securing that funding and long-term thinking is so important. If we look at cost competitiveness for processing facilities, like a Chinese facility might be 3 to 4 times less expensive than one in Canada today. So how do we square that? How do we close that gap? Unless we start now, it's not going to be happening, right? And we need to start now. That's key.
I think I would go back to my original point about uncertain times in geopolitics. And again, this is, it's challenging, but it is an opportunity. I think Canada has the trust of the EU and vice versa. We need more events to engage, government to government, industry to industry. And the events exist. We were at the Raw Materials Summit here in Brussels in May. Sam putting on today's event. Next month we've got Raw Materials Week. March we've got PDAC, bringing together sort of international, EU and Canada governments and industry, and pushing some of these projects across the line.
Thank you so much. We purposely left 10 minutes into the session for you to ask your questions. You have a unique opportunity here because you've got the raw material production, you've got the ones that are doing the product. Ricardo is they're making the products for the transition. And obviously, Jan has a very good contextual knowledge on the business side. And myself, I work more in the energy transition and on the circular economy at Tata Consulting Services. So if you have any questions around these topics, it's, I would say, a great opportunity for you to ask them or comments. There is a question. Do you have the microphone?
Good afternoon, Enrico Borella from CEC, the European Association of Mining Equipment Manufacturers. I know that some of you are here to promote Canadian raw materials flowing to Europe, but I just wanted to have an opinion on the quality of the measures that the Critical Raw Materials Act put forward in Europe to try to encourage more mining, and possibly whether this is going to convince some Canadian mining companies to maybe start operations in Europe. Thanks a lot.
I think it's interesting. I think people are unconvinced about what we call the NIMBYism in the not in my backyard. I know I've talked to a lot of people where they've come up with projects. These were in Germany, and a lot of them were sort of turned down pretty quickly. I talked to some people last week that have some great lithium projects, or what look like great lithium projects in Germany. They're mining some tin again over in the UK, some lithium in the UK as well now. So I'm moderately hopeful. I don't think... I think the goals were probably ambitious, given where Europe was starting from in the time frame, is my own personal view. But I do think as the technology improves, as we find ways to mitigate more of the environmental impacts through technology, I do think there will be more in Europe from a proximity transportation perspective. If you can find economic deposits in a place that makes sense, I think it will happen. I think it's a little bit longer term time frame probably to make that happen. But the Eastern Europe, there's a lot more, right? When you look at Eastern Europe, sort of, there's quite a bit more mining, but sort of in more Western Europe, I think that it's a little bit ambitious from my front. But the Canadian miners are already in Ireland. They've been looking in the UK. They're in Eastern Europe. So Canadian miners will go anywhere. I've worked on projects all over the place with clients. So to the extent it can be done, and it can be done economically and get permitted, like, they will show up. So I think it's a matter of time.
I'll add to that as well. I mean, I agree with what Ian's saying. I think for me also the timescales, you know, the diversification objective, a 2030 objective. I mean, it's pushing it, but you know, again, it's the right direction. I think it's sending the right signals. So again, moderately hopeful, I would say, from my perspective.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry, I missed most of your discussion because I was doing something else, but I wanted to ask you a question about processing. And if this is an area where you see potential for better and more cooperation and improvement, because as you know, processing of critical raw materials for the time being is about 90% in China. And where's the potential there?
I spoke a little bit in my remarks about the Saskatchewan Research Council's Rare Earth Elements Processing Facility, and this is the first of its kind in North America. So Saskatchewan's getting quite a bit of attention on this, and so they're taking the rare earth elements, the ores, they're processing it all the way down to the metal ingots. So rare earth elements, the metals. What the next step in that process is bringing it down to the permanent magnets, which go into the motors of electric vehicles. This is getting quite a bit of attention from European OEMs, and a number of them are at NDA/MOU stage with the organization. Uncertainty has made some delays in the processing, but for a province like Saskatchewan, and I think I can speak for overall Canada, we don't just want to be exporting commodities. We want the value add to be happening in Saskatchewan or Canada, and that's what we're trying to do. To build these types of things, it's like the know-how is difficult, and China's not willing to share, right? So we need to develop it ourselves, which can cost money, to Sujith's point.
Yeah, no, I would say Quebec has been definitely working sort of on that path with lithium to try and capture sort of larger parts of that value chain. The goal from the Canadian perspective to sort of go from mine to EV and have that sort of all all in country. But the human capital, the know-how is a challenge. Like I think almost all the hard rock lithium refining has been done from Australia through China, right? Like that's where the know-how is. We had a representative in our office from SQM, sort of the largest, once the largest Chilean lithium producer. And his advice to Canada was hire everyone you can from a processing perspective, because that's a very small number of people globally. And if you don't have that, the rest of this is going to fall apart, right? So I think it's a challenge. I think where people are aware of it, and I think they're trying to solve for that problem. But it is a very small number of people, especially as you get into sort of some of the more niche commodities and processing technologies that currently have that ability.
Time, so thank you for your attention. Thank you to the panelists. And anyways, we're going to be around if you have other questions or comments. Thank you so much.